A giant's resting place. You might have seen it as you walk past the old fort. It looks just like a dip in the grass. Sometimes it is filled with water, but there are always rocks beside it. Most people know it because they have to walk the long way round the field, and all you can hear is them grumbling and groaning. When the rain comes down, it fills with water, and it makes it slimy and slippery, but it didn't get there by accident. A long time before now, there was a giant who was as tall as a mountain and as strong as a tree. He was happy when he was by himself because, when he was by himself, there was no one to frighten. He didn't really want to frighten anyone, it was just that he was so tall and strong that they thought that he would hurt them. He would hide in amongst the rocks and look at his reflection in the smooth water of the sea and wonder why no one could see that he was not frightening at all. In fact, he just wanted to be happy, the same as you and me. When he wasn't hiding, his favourite thing was to eat sweet rocks from the countryside. He had had enough of the salty rocks from the flat, calm sea, and he knew it was best to go there at night, when everyone was safely in bed. On one hot July morning at about midday, he couldn't stand the heat any more, and he gathered the sweetest rocks that he could find and sat down with his back against the cool walls of the old fort. With his back bent and in the shadow, he didn't look so tall. As he sat there eating, a little girl came by. She sat down beside him and started to eat her own picnic. In the shade, he looked just a little bit bigger than her own dad. She even offered him some of her sandwiches, but he was too busy eating through the sweet country rocks.
Thank you,
he boomed as he quickly munched and crunched his way through a particularly tasty piece of obsidian. He was amazed that she wasn't frightened of him. His parents had told him that everyone was frightened of giants, and yet this little girl was the best company he had ever had in all of his long life. She even giggled when he showered her with some rock crumbs as he ate. He could not have been happier to have finally found a friend, or at least someone who was not frightened by the way that he looked. The two of them laughed and burped and belched. They showed each other what they had in their mouths and pulled silly faces as they ate their granite and cupcakes. It was only as he stood up that she realised just how big he was. Just like his parents had told him, just like his parents had warned him, she screamed. It scratched at his ears like a shark's tooth. It gave him such a fright that he tumbled backwards and fell to the ground with such a crash that he could feel his body sinking into the ground. The little girl cried, and no one believed her that the giant had been there and had fallen into the earth. Even when she was an old woman, she would stand by the side of the hole by the fort and sing, "Sorry for frightening you, my good friend giant. Sorry for frightening you, my good friend giant." And she would throw a small piece of rock into the pool that was filled with the giant's tears. The king's cloak for a beggar. In a place that I have never been, but I know someone who has, there is a dusty road. On one side it leads to the countryside, and on the other it goes straight to the door of a king's castle. If you travel on that road today, you can still see people stop by the side of a creaking gate, touch a few scraps of fine red wool caught on a rusty nail, and bow and curtsy and laugh. Even when the sun is high in the sky, they will still pretend to shiver as if it were the coldest day in the year. People say that once there was a king and a queen who had more money than there were stars in the sky, but that didn't stop them wanting more. One windy October evening in the height of autumn, they decided that they would go out and find someone to give them money. To make sure that they were not spotted for being too clean, they rubbed some ashes from the pudding pot onto their faces and hands and pretended to be bent-backed, old and weak. They didn't care who they got the money from. It was nothing to them if they were rich or poor, young or old. They were just so determined that they would not come back into the castle empty-handed. Everyone knew just how stingy and mean the king and queen were, and they didn't stop talking about it, but only behind the king and queen's backs. To be honest, it was just about all that anyone talked about, apart from the weather. As you can imagine, this regal pair couldn't really walk out in all of their fine clothes, so they sneaked out, sly as foxes, and tottered slowly on crooked sticks. To make sure no one knew it was them, they hid their fine scarlet cloaks under some raggedy blankets that they clutched up to their dirt-smeared noses. How they laughed to think of the money they would get that night as out they went, their begging arms outstretched in front of them. They cackled as they were muttering about how terrible poor we are, and we have no food in our bellies these fine 3 days. The people who lived in those parts might not have had much, but they would share what little they had with any and everyone, and soon this deceitful pair of royal crooks had a good haul of money in the soft leather wallets they kept hidden in their beautiful red cloaks. Now, in that village, upon that road, there lived a man, a good man with a willing heart, but never 2 farthings to rub together to his name. But kindness was no stranger to his heart and eyes. He pulled his own tight, thin cloth coat to his chin and chest as the cold night clawed at his skin, and made his way towards his home with the castle at his back. As the autumn evening turned to night, he could see something or someone coming towards him, and it sounded so pitiful. Such a weeping and a wailing, and the words became clearer as the 2 figures and he approached each other. It was a gruff man's voice that he heard first. "'Tis a terrible thing that this king has so much and we have so little." The figure of the woman agreed. I have heard that the queen eats naught but larks' tongues and drinks the tears of unicorns, and still we find ourselves so cold. The king and queen were loving this. After all, they just wanted to have some money, find out what everyone thought of them, and take some of this last stranger's money before they could sit down and gloat and count their haul by the side of a roaring fire. Pietro was this kind stranger's name. He stopped and spoke. "Old Damon, sir, it is indeed a great shame that you 2 are so cold." He patted at his near-empty pockets. "I wish that there was something that I could give you, but—" He pulled out a coin the size of an otter's eye. "I have no more than this old coin that I was hoping that I could employ to buy a crust of bread." As I have said, the king and queen did not care who gave them money or how much, and it was the king who snatched at the coin from out of Pietro's hand with neither a thanks or a goodbye. Pietro was shocked, but still he smiled. "It is indeed a strange thing that the king has no need in his heart to help his people. For if anyone needed to be helped in their old age, then it is you." You would have thought that these two would have been glad to have made this the last of their thieving that night, but it was the Queen who started to weep and wail next. "Oh, now I have nothing, and the terrible cold is pulling up my skin, and I with nothing but this old blanket to keep me warm." She raised her voice. "Kind stranger, is there nothing more that you could find to give to me? A poor maltreated old dame who has done nothing in this world to deserve such a cold to claw at my skin." Pietro looked at himself, and all that he had was a thin cloth coat upon him. But he did not hesitate to pull from his back. Her cries had been so heartfelt. Again he spoke. "Old woman, it is so small that I cannot place this upon your back, but we can place it beneath your blanket, and hopefully it will keep you warm. I have no more." He reached towards her and made to lift the blanket and help her on with his coat, but she screeched and ran. Her voice changed and sounded like a woman from the court of a king. "No, it is all right. I do not need your coat." As she ran, she crashed into the king, and his disguise slipped from his fingers, and he stood there in all of his finery. They scrambled about one another, and the more they tried to run away, the more they entangled and lay in a heap upon the dusty ground. "We are not the king and queen," they howled. But it was obvious to anyone that they were. "We are not the king and queen." Their bright red, thick woolen cloaks were getting caught in the brambles by the side of the road, and Pietro just watched as they were covered in scratches and blackberry juice, and the voices rose in anger and confusion. "We are not the king and queen." They kept on shouting as they dropped the cloaks and ran as fast as they could to the safety of the castle. Pietro looked inside of the cloaks and saw all of the money inside of the leather pouches. He sorted through them all and found his small coin, and wandered about with the king's cloak upon his back, and shared the money that he found with all those who had as big a heart as he. When he grew too old to travel on that dusty road, he hung the cloaks upon a gate by the side of the castle, and somehow no one ever saw a couple of beggars with blankets for cloaks on the highway again.